Throughout a lot of most recent videos, I've alluded to the M1 Macs I think that are worth it, and ones I think you should skip, or certain Apple Silicon Macs you should probably wait for. So in today's video, I thought it would just make sense to do a comprehensive breakdown on what I think you should go for, what you should wait for, and what to expect with the timeline of this transition. Let's begin. In case you're curious, no, Apple has not made this easy on me because they've done so many weird things with the Apple Silicon transition that I was not expecting. So overall, I think that if you're in the market for something like a MacBook Air or a Mac Mini, now is not a bad time to buy. The main reason is because I don't think the MacBook Air or the Mac Mini are going to get any type of major updates somewhat soon. I feel like they gave the M1 chip to the both of them, and they don't really plan on changing that for the next year at minimum. You know, most of the time with Macs, it's kind of hard to know what you should buy because for a lot of laptops, Apple will refresh them every 6 months or sometimes refresh them once and then 5 months later refresh them again. These two, I feel pretty confident in saying that I don't feel like they're gonna do much with them for the foreseeable future. I know that the Mac Mini is very empty and they could probably redesign it to be smaller or better utilize desktop chips, but personally, the way I've seen Apple handle the Mac Mini in most recent history is they care about it, but they're not going to update it quite regularly. In fact, until it got the M1 chip, it was basically untouched since 2018. So I have a feeling the Mac Mini isn't really going to get any type of substantial, noticeable updates for another year or maybe two, unless they decide that, you know what, maybe the Mac Mini should have 4 USB-C ports, so we'll update it again. But if you're wondering what should get updated and is right around the corner, my best bet is the 13-inch MacBook Pro with 4 USB-C ports. That is likely Apple's next target for Apple Silicon. So if you were debating on whether or not you should get a MacBook Pro with Apple Silicon and your budget was somewhere north of $1,800, then I would say probably wait, because I feel like there's a good chance we could even see that as soon as March as next year. So you're not too far away. And personally, I just wouldn't recommend anybody get the current M1 MacBook Pro because performance-wise, I know it has a fan, but in all the speed tests I've seen, it honestly makes a fairly little difference. And sure, it might have a slightly better battery life, but whenever you're using high-intensive programs like Final Cut or Xcode, those types of things are going to be very power hungry, and that's when you don't see all of those battery life gains. And when you're doing mild things like web browsing or checking email or just managing social media, yeah, that's when you'll get that insane high efficiency of the M1 chip. But when it comes to exporting or live streaming long periods of time, that's when you see the battery life shrink down very quickly. And if the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 chip but only having 2 USB-C ports, if that seems good for you, I would highly encourage you to just try a MacBook Air first. See if that can get by and see if you can live without the touch bar, save yourself some money, maybe spend that money on some extra RAM or some extra storage, and see if a fanless architecture can work well for you, because in all the performance comparisons I've seen, it seems like having a fan or not having a fan doesn't result in huge gains that you will actually notice. Personally, if I were making a prediction, which I will, because why not, I will say that the 13-inch MacBook Pro that gets updated in March will probably be rocking something like an M1X chip, and it has slightly better graphics and perhaps better performance, of course, as well. It is an X series chip, and this will of course have 2 Thunderbolt controllers, which means that any Mac they put the M1X chip into will now support 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports instead of just 2. That's why they'll bring it to the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and my other guess is that they will also bring that to the 24-inch redesigned iMac. That's more speculative, but there's been a lot of analysts and rumors saying that in the first quarter of next year we would see that redesigned iMac. I know they've been saying it for the past few quarters, but now that the transition has officially begun, making that smaller tier iMac rock the same type of CPU and GPU performance that the 13-inch MacBook Pro is capable of just simply makes sense to me, because it seems like with Apple Silicon they're willing to stretch it across lots of different products. So M1X chip I feel like is the next inevitable move, and then perhaps what's more down the road into more the second half of 2021, which would be post Worldwide Developers Conference, or perhaps they wait until October. That's when they would start bringing the M1T chip or the M2 chip, whatever they decide to call it, the next generation of Apple Silicon with even better performance than the M1X. That'll be making its way into the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and then probably the larger size 32-inch iMac. And these I could also see rocking dedicated GPUs built by Apple. Maybe we were getting a little taste of it with the Afterburner cards they were were designing for the Mac Pro. So my prediction, in case you're missing it, is that by the end of 2021, we're gonna have Apple Silicon in pretty much all of the iMacs. Maybe they keep the iMac Pro around if you're just a diehard Intel fan and you need boot camp. But all of the MacBooks will be transitioned over, and there's a lot of evidence pointing to redesigned MacBooks launching at the end of 2021 that would be rocking mini LED displays, probably a more fresh design approach, and no word on the pricing of those. If those get more expensive, that would suck, but hopefully the cost savings of switching away from Intel can just go towards making the display better and keeping the prices about where they are today. But if you're wondering how far away the 16-inch MacBook Pro refresh is, or adequate successor to the 27-inch iMac, I think it could be after June of next year, but 13-inch MacBook Pro with 4 USB-C ports and a 24-inch iMac, which will have pretty great performance with the M1X chip, but perhaps not a dedicated GPU anymore because they're just going for affordability, and the integrated graphics in the M1X chip will be good enough that for whatever you're buying a 24-inch iMac for, it'll be covered. Those I could see launching in the first half of 2021, and then of course if you're curious about the Mac Pro, I mean, I imagine that being very, very last, so probably not until summer of 2022, and I imagine the Mac Pro still rocking Intel for quite some time. If they are gonna ditch the Intel Mac Mini that they're still shipping, I would also see that happening maybe in the first half of 2021, but again, Apple doesn't like to update the Mac Mini very regularly, so there's also a good chance that they just keep around that Intel option for just some people who prefer Intel and don't want to run into software compatibility issues and want boot camp for whatever reason. They just keep that on the site as an option until this 2-year transition is completed. So I feel like there's a good chance that they're just going to leave Intel in that one Mac Mini until summer of 2022 and then finally replace it with something like an M1X. That way the Mac Mini can still be rocking a 4 USB-C port I/O like it did originally in 2018, but Apple couldn't fit a second Thunderbolt controller, so who cares? If you're happy with the Mac Mini's current I/O and you're asking yourself, which Mac should I buy today? Which one is the best value? Personally, I would say the Mac Mini, just being so affordable and having a lot more I/O than the MacBooks have to offer. If you're not a laptop person and you just want the best M1 chip performance you can get and you need a Mac today, Mac Mini I think is a very safe way to go. You can still utilize HDMI 2.0 on the back of that thing, output it to a 4K monitor, and have 2 vacant Thunderbolt 3 ports that you can reserve for high data transfer speeds, and neither of those ports have to be occupied for your power because it has a separate power plug, whereas if you're buying something like a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air with the M1 chip, those are the only ports you're going to get aside from the headphone jack, and you're probably going to end up needing to charge them at some point, and that's going to occupy a port unless you're willing to get a bunch of adapters and feed everything through one port like I am with the MacBook Air right now. Review coming on that soon. But yeah, as empty as the Mac Mini is, I would say for what it's costing you, probably the best way to get your hands on Apple Silicon now. And if you need those 4 USB-C ports, I'm sure the lineup will be much more consistent and clean by the end of next year. 13-inch MacBook Pro probably getting changed next alongside the 24-inch iMac, and then later in the year we'll see 16-inch MacBook Pro and the 32-inch iMac. Anyway, with that information, I hope you can make yourselves the right decision, and as confusing as it may be, it does result in better battery life, better performance, and more efficient processing speeds. So overall, a win in my book. What are you guys most excited for in the Apple Silicon lineup? Feel free to let me know. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.